A millionaire is stopped at his company by the deaf daughter of the cleaning lady. The girl makes a gesture, trying to tell him something, but he doesn't understand. The mother, who saw everything, is left in shock. Hours later, he approaches the maid and asks what her daughter meant. Fearful, she reveals the message, and the powerful man was not prepared for the answer, breaking down in tears. The polished marble of the hallway reflected the cold, impersonal light of the recessed ceiling fixtures, creating a tunnel of silence and order. For Arthur Sterling, that silence was the soundtrack to his success. Each step of his handmade Italian leather shoes echoed with the weight of an empire built on discipline and relentless ambition. Yet, behind the impeccably tailored suit and the posture of a man who commanded the world from the city's tallest skyscraper, there was a crease of weariness between his brows that not even the most expensive treatments could erase. Late that afternoon, a rare break between meetings took him down a less traveled path, a service corridor that served as a shortcut to the West Wing. And it was there, in that anonymous universe of cleaning carts and metal doors, that the calculated symphony of his life was interrupted by a dissonant note. In a small alcove, almost hidden behind a pillar, a woman in a uniform was crouched down. He vaguely recognized her as one of the new hires on the cleaning crew. What made him stop, however, was not her, but the small figure seated on the floor in front of her. It was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, with dark hair pulled back into a clumsy ponytail. The woman, who he would later learn was named Elena, was holding a small, soft roll. With the precision of someone dividing a treasure, she broke it in two and offered the larger half to the child. The mother's hands, chapped from her work, moved with a tenderness that contrasted brutally with the sterile environment. The girl accepted the bread with solemn seriousness, without a word. It was when she lifted her face that Arthur's world tilted on its axis. The girl looked directly at him. Her eyes were large and dark, with a depth that seemed to hold all the world's questions. But none of them were of fear or reverence. It was pure, disarming curiosity. She didn't see him as the owner of all this, the man whose name was whispered with a mix of admiration and fear. To her, he was just a man standing in a hallway. Arthur felt a sharp discomfort, a pang in a place he had long forgotten existed. The scene was a mirror reflecting not their poverty, but his emptiness. He averted his gaze, feeling like an intruder, and quickened his pace toward his private elevator. The brushed steel doors closed, sealing him off from the world, just as he always preferred. At the top of the building, in his panoramic office, the city stretched out at his feet, a kingdom of concrete and light that he commanded but did not truly inhabit. He sat in his leather chair, his fingers drumming on the mahogany desk. He tried to focus on the reports, on the numbers that had always brought him comfort and security. But the numbers danced and transformed into two dark, curious eyes. The image of that shared role, of that silent communion, refused to leave. It was a smudge of humanity on his perfectly aseptic canvas. He glanced at the corner of his desk, at a silver picture frame that had lain face down for nearly 2 years. He didn't dare touch it. The silence in his office was different now. It was no longer the sound of power, but the echo of loneliness. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur Sterling wondered what was on the other side of his fortress of glass. He didn't know it, but that small image in the hallway was a crack, the first of many that were about to shatter the wall he had built around himself. What had he seen in that child's eyes that had disarmed him so completely? The days that followed were filled with a restlessness Arthur couldn't name. The image of the mother and daughter sharing the role superimposed itself over profit charts and market projections, an anomaly in his world of cold logic. He found himself altering his routes through the building, driven by a curiosity that irritated him, hoping to glimpse that scene of raw humanity again. It was on Wednesday, during the lunch rush, that he found her, driven by an impulse. He went down to the main employee cafeteria, a place he hadn't visited in years. The room was a buzz of conversation and clattering silverware, a sea of well-fed employees. And there, at a table in the farthest corner, was Eleanor, alone. In front of her was only a glass of water. She stared at her empty plate with an expression of forced dignity, as if trying to convince herself she wasn't hungry. Arthur felt the same pang from the hallway, but sharper this time, more acute. He walked toward her, his steps silencing the nearest table. Elena looked up, and shock transformed her face. She shot to her feet, her hands twisting in her apron. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry, I was just leaving." Her voice was a thread. He ignored her. "Where is your food?" he asked, his tone harsher than he intended. Shame colored Elena's cheeks. She dropped her gaze to the floor. I'm not hungry today." "Sir?" The lie was so transparent it hurt. Arthur looked around at the full plates, then back at her. A strange feeling, a mix of anger and something akin to compassion, washed over him. Without another word, he turned, walked to the cafeteria manager, and gave a short, clear order. Minutes later, the best meal of the day, complete with dessert and a juice box, was delivered to Elena's table, along with an identical portion for the girl. Elena watched him from a distance, paralyzed between gratitude and dread. Hours later, as Arthur crossed the main lobby, he felt a light tug on his pants. He looked down. It was the girl, Leah. She stood there, looking up at him with those same serious, inquisitive eyes. Before he could react, she brought her small hands to her chest and made a quick gesture. A brilliant smile lit up her face. And then she turned and ran into the arms of her mother, who was watching from a distance, pale as wax. Arthur stood there, confused. The gesture meant nothing to him, but the mother's panicked reaction was unmistakable. The curiosity was now an itch he had to scratch. At the end of the day, he intercepted her near the locker rooms. "What did your daughter mean?" he asked, without preamble. Elena flinched. "Sir, please, I'm so sorry. She doesn't know what she's doing. It's just a childish thing. She didn't mean to bother you." "I insist," he said, his voice low but unyielding. She hesitated, fear warring with the direct order from her boss. Finally, her voice choked, almost a whisper. She revealed it. She said she doesn't have a father, but that, after what you did today, if she did, she'd want him to be just like you. The sentence didn't land like a compliment. It hit Arthur with the force of a punch to the gut. The irony was cruel, crushing. A strange girl saw him as a hero, while his own son, Daniel, would barely look him in the face. He couldn't form a response. The armor that protected him from the world shattered into 1,000 pieces. He just turned, his back rigid, and walked toward his elevator. In his office, with the door locked, the silence brought no peace. He walked to his desk. Wood picked up the overturned picture frame and stood it upright. The smiling face of a younger Daniel stared back at him. The dam he had built for years, brick by brick of work, ambition and distance, finally broke. The sound of a dry sob shattered the silence of the top floor. The lament of a man who had the world but had lost the only thing that truly mattered. The interaction in the lobby did not have just two witnesses. From the shadow of a granite column, a third pair of eyes was watching. Rick Connolly, junior partner and second in command at Sterling Corp, saw everything. Where Arthur saw a puzzle, Rick saw an opportunity. He observed the girl's touch, the confusion on his boss's face, and most telling of all, the mother's terrified pallor. To Rick's cynical and ambitious mind, the scene contained no innocence. He had been Arthur's shadow for 15 years, the man of spreadsheets and logistics, while Arthur was the visionary, the face of the company. A corrosive envy, cultivated over years of meetings where his ideas were overshadowed by Arthur's charisma, simmered beneath his loyal facade. Lately, he had noticed the change in Arthur. The distraction, the distant gaze, the melancholy that clung to him like a second skin. Rick, however, saw not the pain of a man, but a crack in a king's armor. And the scene he had just witnessed was the hammer he needed to widen that crack until everything crumbled. He didn't rush to spread what he saw. Rick was a snake, not a hound. He moved with subtlety. The next day, over coffee with one of the most influential board members, he planted the first seed. "Have you noticed Arthur's a bit distant lately?" he asked, his tone laced with feigned concern. "Seems like something personal is affecting him. Just yesterday, I saw him in a rather peculiar situation with one of the cleaning staff. Nothing, of course, but strange." He let the word strange hang in the air, allowing the other's imagination to do the rest. The seed sprouted. Over the week, Rick watered it with more veiled insinuations, casual remarks about Arthur's lack of focus and his concern for his friend's well-being. He knew a rumor alone wouldn't be enough to topple a giant like Arthur Sterling. He needed something concrete, proof that would turn suspicion into fact. In his office, all glass and steel, as modern as Arthur's was classic, he began to hatch his plan. First, he accessed the employee records. Elena Ramirez, single mother, address in a modest neighborhood, minimum wage. The perfect profile for his narrative, a vulnerable woman taking advantage of an emotionally compromised boss. The idea took shape in his mind, brilliant and perverse. Money. A significant transfer from Arthur's personal account to hers. It would be irrefutable proof of an inappropriate relationship, a scandal the board, obsessed with image and corporate ethics, could not ignore. The challenge was creating that proof. But Rick knew the company's secrets, not just the markets, but the people's. He knew who had debts, who held grudges, who would do anything for an extra bonus. He picked up the phone and dialed an internal extension, the head of accounting. "Marcus, I need a favor," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "It's a delicate matter. I need you to create a mock bank statement, just an exercise, for an internal security project I'm developing. Totally confidential, of course." There was a pause on the other end. Rick smiled. He knew Marcus, whom he had helped promote, wouldn't dare refuse. "Consider it done, Rick," came the reply. Rick hung up, leaning back in his chair. The game had begun. He looked out his window at the neighboring building where Arthur's office glowed in the twilight. He wasn't just planning to take Arthur's place. He was planning to destroy him, using his boss's newfound compassion as the murder weapon. The buzz of the rumor started low, a whisper in hallway corners, an exchange of glances in the cafeteria. At first, it seemed like simple office gossip, but Rick's skillfully planted lie had poisonous roots that spread quickly through the fertile soil of corporate curiosity and boredom. "Did you hear about the boss? Seems he has a special interest in the new cleaning lady. They say he gave her an expensive gift. I saw her daughter with him in the lobby. They looked pretty cozy." Each version was more distorted than the last, twisting an act of compassion into a sordid scandal. Elena, oblivious to it all, continued her work with the same quiet discretion. The only change in her routine was a constant fear of running into Mr. Sterling again, a fear mixed with a gratitude she didn't know how to express. She brought Leah to work with an even heavier heart, hiding her more carefully, praying not to be discovered and lose the job that was her only lifeline. The explosion came on Friday. Rick chose his moment with a surgeon's precision. With the forged bank statement in hand, a masterpiece of fakery showing a $10,000 transfer from Arthur's personal account to Elena Ramirez's, with the description, "personal support," he called an emergency meeting with the head of human resources and the director of operations. His expression was that of a man performing a painful duty. "I regret having to bring this to light," he began, "but my loyalty is to this company. We have a serious situation. Our CEO's behavior has become a liability to Sterling Corp's reputation. He slid the statement across the table. The silence that followed was heavy. The proof was damning. Rick's narrative, once just a whisper, now had the weight of an official document. To contain the damage and protect the company's integrity, the decision was swift and brutal. Elena was cleaning the glass of the main lobby when two security guards and the HR manager approached. Her first reaction was panic. They had found out about Leah, but what happened was far worse. "Ms. Ramirez, please come with us," the manager said, her face an impenetrable mask. "Your employment with this company is terminated, effective immediately." Elena's world spun. "What? Why? I didn't do anything." Her voice was a desperate plea. "You are being dismissed for inappropriate conduct and violation of the Code of Conduct," the woman said, reciting from a script. "Please collect your personal items." The humiliation was public and calculated. She was escorted to the locker room, given 5 minutes to empty her small locker, and then led out of the building under the curious and judgmental stares of dozens of employees. It was rush hour, and the lobby was packed. Every step was agony. No one said a word, but their eyes condemned her. Outside, on the cold sidewalk, she found herself holding a small cardboard box with her few belongings, the city's noise turning into a distant hum. Where was Leah? The girl was hidden in a small supply closet where Elena left her during the last hour of her shift. The wave of panic that hit her was stronger than the shame. She had to get back. She tried to re-enter, but the guards blocked her at the door. "I can't. My daughter is in there," she begged, tears finally breaking through her dignity. One of the guards, an older man with a weary look, hesitated. 20 minutes later, one of Elena's co-workers, her face full of pity, brought Leah out by the hand. The confused girl ran to her mother. Elena hugged her tightly, burying her face in her daughter's hair so she wouldn't see her despair. From the top of his empire, Arthur Sterling only learned of the incident hours later in a formal email from HR. The anger he felt was cold and sharp. He marched to Rick's office, ready to reverse this injustice, but Rick was waiting, calm and prepared, with the fake statement on his desk. "I did what was necessary to protect you and the company, Arthur. The situation got out of hand." Arthur looked at the paper, at the lie printed in black and white. He knew it was fake, but how could he prove it? He was cornered, caught in his partner's web. The poison of the rumor now solidified into a fabricated piece of evidence that made him an accomplice and responsible for the ruin of an innocent woman. The door of the modest apartment closed with a soft click, but to Eleanor, it sounded like the clang of a prison cell. The cardboard box of her belongings fell to the floor, spilling a bottle of hand lotion and a small, sun-shaped keychain Leah had given her. The girl, sensing her mother's anguish, clung to her leg. Her large, dark eyes filled with a concern beyond her years. For Eleanor, unemployment was more than the loss of a paycheck. It was the collapse of the fragile house of cards she called a life. That job, however exhausting and low-paying, was the only barrier between her and the abyss. It was the rent, the food, Leah's hearing aids, which needed to be replaced soon. Now, that barrier was gone. The following days became a slow-motion nightmare. The news of her dismissal for inappropriate conduct was an invisible but indelible stain on her name. In every job interview she managed to get, the same suspicious look would appear when they got to her previous experience. She tried to explain, to say it was a misunderstanding, but her words sounded weak against the unspoken accusation. The humiliation in the Sterling Corp lobby haunted her. The stares, the whispers, the feeling of being judged and condemned without a trial. The worst part was the helplessness. How do you fight a giant, a rumor you don't even fully understand? Her last paycheck evaporated like water in the desert. First, it was the late utility bill. Then, the grocery trips became smaller, fresh fruit and vegetables replaced by rice and beans. The eviction notice arrived in a plain brown envelope, cold and impersonal. The landlord, once friendly, now barely met her eyes. "I'm sorry, Elena, but I have my own bills to pay." She and Leah began living on favors, a night at an old neighbor's house, two on a distant cousin's sofa. Each new place was a reminder of her failure. She smiled for Leah, invented games and stories to protect her daughter's innocence, but inside, despair was digging a deeper and deeper hole. Meanwhile, miles away in his office overlooking the city, Arthur was living his own hell. Guilt ate at him. The image of Elena being escorted out of the building, which he had seen on the security footage, replayed in his mind. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he felt completely powerless. Rick had trapped him masterfully. Any attempt to rehire Elena or help her financially would only confirm the rumor. The board, manipulated by Rick's narrative, now watched him with suspicion. "Arthur, you need to distance yourself from this," Rick had said, with his false solidarity, "for the good of the company." The word that had always been his compass, his refuge, now sounded like a cage. In an act of desperation, seeking a connection untainted by lies and self-interest, he called his son. Daniel answered after the fifth ring. "What is it?" The teenager's voice was a wall of indifference. Arthur tried. He tried to find the right words to bridge the chasm between them. "Daniel, I just wanted to see how you are." There was a silence on the other end, followed by a short, humorless laugh. "Now you want to know. A little late, don't you think?" "Son, don't call me son." Daniel cut him off, his voice suddenly thick with old pain. "You only call when your perfect world is falling apart. You only care about your company. That's why Mom left you." The line went dead. Arthur held the silent phone, his son's words echoing in his mind. "You only care about your company." The phrase intertwined with Leah's silent message. The innocence of a child had elected him an ideal father, while his own son condemned him for the father he never was. The pain was physical, a pressure in his chest that left him breathless. He looked out the window, at the city lights that seemed to mock his loneliness. He had built an empire, but he was losing every battle that mattered. And somewhere in that same city, a mother and her daughter were paying the price for his mistake, a price he felt powerless to repay. The summons for the extraordinary board meeting arrived in Arthur's email like a sentence. The subject: re-evaluation of executive leadership. The words were diplomatic, corporate, but the meaning was crystal clear. Rick had called checkmate. In less than a week, he would use the fabricated scandal to justify removing Arthur from the position he had held for 20 years. The irony was crushing. He would be brought down not by a market miscalculation or a bad business deal, but by a distorted act of kindness. The office, once his sanctuary of power, now felt like a gilded cage. Every object, the awards, the photos with world leaders, the exponential growth charts, was a testament to a success that felt hollow and fragile. He thought about fighting, about exposing Rick, but with what? His word against a bank statement and a carefully orchestrated smear campaign. He would be seen as a desperate man trying to save his own skin. The humiliation would be even greater. The conversation with Daniel had broken him in a way no business crisis ever had. His son's words had stripped him of his defenses, forcing him to face the man in the mirror, a stranger who had traded his family for a stack of reports and balance sheets. For the first time, he considered giving up. Maybe it was better this way. Surrender the empire, retreat into the shadows, and try somehow to rebuild the bridges he himself had dynamited. It was at this low point, slumped in his leather chair, that an unexpected memory surfaced from the depths of his mind. Not a memory of glory or conquest, but a simple image, Elena's face, pale with fear but with an unshakable dignity, Leah's brilliant smile, a beacon of innocence in a cynical world. They had nothing, yet they possessed an integrity that he, with all his wealth, felt he was about to lose. To give up would be to validate Rick's lie. It would mean allowing injustice to prevail. It would mean that mother and daughter's suffering had been in vain. A spark of his old fighting spirit reignited. This was no longer about the company, no longer about power. It was about something more fundamental. It was about the truth. He stood up and began to pace, his mind, finally clear of the fog of self-pity, working at full speed. Rick was meticulous, but arrogance was his weakness. He would think himself invincible, certain he had covered every track, but there is always a track. Arthur thought of all the company's systems, every security protocol, and then, like a lightning strike, the memory hit. The Ark. It was the nickname the IT team had given the old security backup system, installed years ago after a catastrophic main server failure. It was a redundant system, expensive and slow, that everyone considered obsolete. With the migration to new cloud servers, the Ark had been all but forgotten, kept active only on a whim of Arthur's, who always believed in having a contingency for the contingency plan. No one would remember it. No one. Except him and a handful of old-timers. One of them was George, the head of security, a quiet, loyal man who had been with him since the beginning. George was old school, distrustful of modern tech, and valued loyalty above all else. Arthur picked up his personal cell, not the company line. "George, I need you. My office, now. And don't mention this to anyone." Half an hour later, the office door opened, and George entered. His face a mask of concern. "Mr. Sterling, what's happened?" Arthur cut him off. "George, do you remember the Ark?" The security chief's face lit up with a flicker of understanding. "The dinosaur in the sub-basement." "Yes, sir. No one's touched it in years." "I need you to access it," Arthur said, his voice firm for the first time in weeks. "I need you to find something for me. Something that might save all of us." The plan was risky. If Rick found out, it would be over. But as he looked into George's loyal eyes, Arthur felt a surge of hope. He was no longer alone in his cage. The fight had just begun, and he wasn't going down without exposing the truth, no matter the cost. The board meeting was in 48 hours. The clock was ticking. The sub-basement of the Sterling building was a labyrinth of ducts and cables, a forgotten world beneath the gleam of the corporate empire. The air was cold and smelled of dust and ozone. There, in a locked, climate-controlled room, sat the Ark. A row of old servers hummed softly, their lights blinking in a slow, steady rhythm, like a sleeping heart. For Arthur and George, that room became their secret headquarters. While the rest of the building slept, they dove into terabytes of old data. The work was excruciating. The system's interface was archaic, the commands were slow, and every search took an eternity to process. George, with his methodical patience, navigated the logs, while Arthur, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, tried to connect the pieces of the puzzle. "Rick is smart," George muttered, his eyes fixed on the green and black screen. He wouldn't have used his own computer. He would have used a public terminal, one that couldn't be traced back to him. But he would need administrator access to create a document with the official look of the bank, Arthur countered. "Be that access is restricted, and every use, even on shared terminals, leaves a log." The first night of searching yielded nothing. Frustration began to set in. Time was their greatest enemy. The board meeting loomed like a storm on the horizon. Arthur glanced at the clock. 4 a.m. His mind was fuzzy with exhaustion, but the image of Leah, offering him an innocent smile, kept him going. "Let's try a different way," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. Let's not search for Rick's login. Let's search for the file's creation, the statement, There has to be a record of when a file with that name or format was generated on any computer in the network. It was the turning point. George adjusted the search parameters, filtering by date and file type. The machine hummed, processing the new order. The hours crawled by. The sun began to rise, painting the sky orange and purple, but in the windowless bunker, time seemed to stand still, and then it happened. A single log entry blinked on the screen. A PDF file named Trans-as-er PDF was created at 8:17 p.m. on the night of the scandal. The terminal used was in the 34th floor conference room, a floor rarely used, under maintenance that week, and the access login was that of Marcus, the head of accounting. Arthur felt a chill. It was the missing piece. Rick wouldn't get his hands dirty. He had used a scapegoat, coercing a subordinate to do the dirty work. But the Ark recorded more than just logins. It recorded everything. George, his fingers nimble, dug deeper into the search, and they found what they needed. The Ark's backup system didn't just save the files, but also the security camera footage, synced to every network activity log. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. They opened the video file corresponding to the exact time of the log entry. The image was grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. The 34th floor hallway camera showed a figure entering the conference room. It wasn't Marcus. It was Rick Connolly. The video showed him glancing down both ends of the hall before slipping inside. Minutes later, the internal camera from the room caught him turning on the computer, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. They had it. The smoking gun. Rick hadn't just ordered the forgery. He had overseen it himself, using another employee's access to cover his tracks. It was more than Arthur had hoped for. It was betrayal in its purest form. George saved the file to a flash drive, a small plastic object that held the power to destroy one man and save another. "We got him," George whispered, relief evident in his voice. Arthur felt no elation. He felt a profound weight, the sadness of confirming the treachery of a man he once considered a friend. But with the sadness came a steely resolve. The board meeting was in a few hours. Rick would arrive confident, ready to deliver the final blow. He had no idea that the truth, resurrected from a digital tomb, was about to be revealed. And the downfall would not be Arthur Sterling's. Elena woke before the sun on the hard couch in her cousin's living room. Her body ached, but it was the ache in her soul that kept her awake through the long nights. Beside her, Leah slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm engulfing her mother's world. Looking at her daughter was both her strength and her greatest anguish. How could she fail this small, dependent being? That morning, she had her last scheduled interview at a small cleaning company on the other side of town. It was her last hope. The money her cousin had lent her was barely enough for the bus fare. She put on her best clothes, a simple but clean blouse, and tied her hair back neatly. "Mommy has to go out for a little while, my angel," she signed to Leah, who had just woken up. "You stay here with your aunt, okay? And be a good girl." Leah nodded, her eyes sleepy, and hugged her mother's legs tightly. The bus ride was long and uncomfortable. At every stop, more people crowded on, pressing her against the window. Outside, the city rushed by, indifferent to her drama. Tall, imposing buildings, like the Sterling Corporate Tower, scraped the sky, reminders of a world she no longer belonged to. The interview address was in an old, run-down commercial building. The interviewer, a middle-aged man with a tired look, scanned her resume with disinterest. "So, Sterling Corp," he said, the company name hanging in the air. "Why'd you leave?" Elena took a deep breath, rehearsing the answer she had practiced so many times. "There were personnel cuts, Kesa. A restructuring." The man peered at her over his glasses. "Funny. A buddy of mine works there. He told me a cleaner got fired for other reasons." The humiliation hit her like a slap. The poison of Rick's lie had spread further than she could have imagined. "That's not true," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was a mistake." The man shrugged. Maybe so, but we can't take the risk. Thanks for your time. Elena walked out of the office feeling hollowed out. On the street, the morning sun felt too bright, the car horns too loud. She walked aimlessly, the tears she had held back for so long finally streaming down her face. There was nowhere left to go. There was no hope left. She sat on a park bench, her head in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. Meanwhile, in his office, Arthur prepared for the battle of his life. The flash drive was secure in his pocket. He didn't feel nervous, just a cold clarity. He reread the speech he'd prepared during the night. It wasn't a defense, but an indictment. Yet, amidst the strategy and the anger, his thoughts turned to Elena and Leah. Saving his company was important, but what about them? The injustice they had suffered wouldn't be erased by Rick's dismissal. They were the true victims, pawns in a power game they hadn't chosen. Victory would be empty if their restoration wasn't complete. He looked at his phone. For a moment, he thought of calling Daniel. He wanted to tell his son, wanted him to see that his father wasn't just the cold businessman he thought. But he stopped himself. Words wouldn't be enough, only actions. And the first action was to clear an innocent woman's name. He buzzed his assistant. "Claudia, I need you to find the current address for an Elena Ramirez, the employee who was let go. Use every resource necessary. It's urgent and confidential." The meeting would begin in 1 hour. The board members were already arriving, their faces grim and impassive. Rick walked into the boardroom with a restrained smile, shaking hands, exuding confidence. He looked at Arthur, a glint of triumph in his eyes. Arthur held his gaze, his own face a mask of calm. The stage was set. The curtain was about to rise on the final act. The boardroom was a place where fortunes were made and unmade, with the nod of a head. A long, polished oak table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a constant reminder of the power contained within these walls. Today, the air was especially thick. The 12 board members were seated, their faces masks of professional neutrality, but the tension was palpable. Rick stood at the head of the table opposite Arthur. The documents that would seal his partner's fate arranged neatly before him. He began to speak, his voice calm and filled with a rehearsed gravity. He spoke of ethics, of brand image, of fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. He painted a picture of Arthur as a compromised leader, distracted by personal issues that were clouding his judgment and putting Sterling Corp's reputation at risk. And, unfortunately, Rick said, pausing for dramatic effect, we have evidence of behavior that crosses the line of impropriety. He passed around copies of the forged bank statement. A murmur went through the room as the members examined the document. The proof seemed irrefutable, Rick's narrative compelling. Arthur remained silent, watching. He let Rick build his own gallows, knot by knot. He saw the certainty in his eyes turn to arrogance. He saw the looks of disappointment and judgment from the board members turn toward him. When Rick finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The chairman of the board, a respected elder statesman of the business world, cleared his throat. "Arthur, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Arthur rose slowly. He didn't look at the papers, but at each person in the room, one by one. "Yes, I do," he said, his voice firm and clear, ringing in the silence. "What Mr. Connolly has presented to you is indeed deeply troubling, a story of deceit, manipulation, and an abuse of power. But he has made one crucial mistake. He's miscast the protagonist." He walked to the large projection screen on the wall. "What you've seen is a work of fiction. Now, allow me to show you the truth." He inserted the flash drive into the laptop connected to the projector. The room dimmed slightly, and the screen came to life. First, he displayed the log from the Ark, highlighting the PDF file's creation, the timestamp, and the terminal used. "This is the creation log for the document you hold in your hands," he explained. "Generated not from a bank, but from a computer on our 34th floor, using the login of one of our department heads." Confusion began to dawn on the board members. Faces. Rick had gone pale, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. He opened his mouth to protest, but Arthur held up a hand. "I'm not finished." He pressed play on the video. The grainy black and white image filled the screen, the empty hallway, the conference room door, and then the unmistakable figure of Rick Connolly, glancing furtively both ways before entering the room. Arthur switched to the internal camera. Rick, seated at the computer, the screen's glow illuminating his focused face. The coup de grace. "As you all know," Arthur continued, as the video played on a silent loop, "our old backup system, the Arc, syncs all network activity logs with security camera footage, a security measure Mr. Connolly seems to have forgotten." The silence in the room was now deafening. All eyes were fixed on Rick, whose face had gone from white to a sickly green. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by the raw, unchecked panic of a man caught in his own trap. It's doctored." "A fake," Rick stammered, shooting to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. But no one was looking at him with anything but contempt. The betrayal was right there, on the screen, for all to see. Arthur's victory was total. He had saved his company, exposed the traitor. But looking at Rick's pathetic figure, he felt no triumph, only a profound weariness. The real challenge, he knew, was just beginning. Restoring his company's integrity was one thing. Restoring his own was another far more difficult task. Rick's fall was as swift as his calculated rise had been. Exposed and humiliated, he was summarily fired, escorted from the building by the same security guards who, weeks earlier, had removed Elena. Corporate justice had been served, but for Arthur, the victory tasted like ash. The episode had left deep scars on the company's culture and, more importantly, on his own soul. He knew that reversing Rick's action was only the first step. True reparation required more than just fixing an administrative wrong. It required an act of humility and a fundamental change in how he led. His first call after the meeting was to the head of human resources. "I want you to draft a formal apology to Ms. Elena Ramirez," he ordered, "and prepare a new contract, not for the cleaning crew. Create a new position for her, head of the Employee Wellness and Inclusion Program." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Sir, with all due respect, she isn't qualified for—" "She's more qualified than any of us," Arthur cut in. "She knows what dignity is and what the lack of it feels like. She knows invisibility. She will be the voice for those we have never listened to. Just do it." His next decision was even more radical. He called a company-wide meeting and announced the creation of the Sterling Foundation, a philanthropic arm of the company dedicated to supporting single-parent families and the education of children with special needs. The seed money would come from his own annual bonus, which he donated in its entirety. The news spread through the company, not as a rumor, but as a shockwave. The ruthless CEO, who once saw only numbers, was now talking about people. But for Arthur, these were just external actions. The real transformation had to happen within. That evening, in his empty house, he sat at the dining room table and wrote 2 letters by hand. The first was to Elena. It was not a corporate apology, but a personal one. He expressed his profound regret for the pain and humiliation she and her daughter had endured, taking full responsibility for the environment that allowed such an injustice to occur. He invited her to return, not out of pity, but because he believed her perspective was essential for the company he now wanted to build. The second letter was to Daniel. It was the hardest thing he had ever written. The words did not come easily. He didn't ask for forgiveness, feeling he didn't deserve it. Instead, he owned his failures. "You were right," he wrote. "I hid behind my work and lost what was most important. I don't know if I can fix what I broke, but I want to try. I want to learn how to be the father you deserve." The next day, Arthur's assistant, Claudia, finally located Elena. She was living temporarily in a small family shelter. Arthur went there himself. He didn't send a driver or a messenger. He drove his own car to a neighborhood he had never visited, feeling like a foreigner in his own city. He found her on a bench in the shelter's small courtyard, watching Leah play with other children. When Elena saw him, her first instinct was fear. She shrank back, bracing for more bad news. Arthur stopped at a respectful distance. He didn't approach her as a boss, but as a man asking for absolution. "Ms. Ramirez," he said, his voice quiet, "I came to deliver this to you personally." He held out the letter. Elena hesitated, then took it. Her eyes scanned the words, and slowly the mask of fear on her face began to dissolve, replaced by a faltering disbelief. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw not fear or reverence, but a silent question. Was this real? Was it possible that redemption existed, not just for her, but for him too? Leah, who had stopped playing, came over and stood by her mother, looking at Arthur with the same disarming curiosity as that first day. She didn't see the villain or the savior of their story. To her, he was just the man who had once given her food, and who now looked at her mother with a sadness she didn't understand, but which felt, somehow, familiar. Elena's transition from a shamed cleaner to the head of a new department was anything but easy. Returning to Sterling Corp was like walking into an emotional minefield. Some colleagues greeted her with warm smiles and sincere apologies, others with sideways glances, the venom of the rumor still lingering in their minds. There were those who saw her as a hero, a victim who had risen, and those who saw her as an opportunist who had somehow manipulated the CEO. Her new office, though small, had a window and a nameplate on the door. It was more space than she had ever had, and at first, she felt like an imposter. The corporate jargon, the meetings, the emails, it was all a new language she had to learn quickly. But what she lacked in administrative experience, she made up for with genuine empathy and a visceral understanding of the needs of the employees, who, like her, were often invisible. Her first project was to overhaul the employee assistance program. She instituted a childcare subsidy, more flexible work hours for parents, and an emergency fund for those facing hardship. Simple ideas, born from her own painful experience, that had an immediate and profound impact. Arthur, for his part, kept a respectful distance, giving her full autonomy. He saw her not as a charity project, but as a valuable partner in rebuilding the company's soul. He watched from afar, learning from her courage and resilience. While Elena's professional life began to flourish, Arthur faced his own challenges at home. After sending the letter, he heard nothing back from Daniel. The days turned into a week of torturous silence. He resisted the urge to call, to force a reaction. For the first time, he understood he needed to give his son space, to respect his pain. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Daniel. He stood on the porch, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Your letter," he said, not stepping inside. "Were you serious?" "Every word," Arthur replied, his heart pounding. Daniel studied him for a long moment. "Mum told me what happened at the company." "About that woman, Elena," Arthur corrected gently. Daniel shrugged, a gesture of indifference that didn't hide the curiosity in his eyes. "Can I come in?" It was the beginning of a slow, delicate reconstruction. They didn't have a single, cathartic conversation. Instead, they found new ground in small gestures. Arthur started going to Daniel's basketball games. He didn't sit in the front row, but found a quiet seat in the bleachers, just watching. Daniel, in turn, began showing up for sporadic weeknight dinners. The conversations were awkward at first, revolving around safe topics like school and sports, but slowly the walls began to come down. One evening, as they were washing dishes, Daniel said, without looking at his father, "I missed you, before everything." The simple, direct confession hit Arthur harder than any accusation. "I missed you too, son," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Every single day." Meanwhile, the Sterling Foundation was taking its first steps. Its first major funded project was the complete modernization of a public school for deaf children, the very one Elena had dreamed of for Leah. Arthur attended the inauguration ceremony. He didn't make a speech. He just stood in the back, watching the children explore the new classrooms, equipped with the latest assistive technology. He saw Leah, beaming, signing animatedly with her new friends. Elena stood beside her, her eyes shining with a pride that no amount of money could buy. In that moment, watching the genuine joy on that little girl's face, Arthur understood the true nature of wealth. It wasn't in stock charts or annual reports. It was in these connections, in the ability to make a real difference in someone's life. The empire he had built of steel and glass seemed insignificant compared to this small universe of smiles and hands dancing in the air. He was beginning to learn a new language, one that didn't involve numbers, but spoke directly to the heart. The annual Sterling Corp charity event was traditionally an extravagant display of power and wealth. A lavish ballroom, self-congratulatory speeches, and oversized checks presented under the flash of cameras. This year, Arthur decided, would be different. The event was moved from the ballroom to the city's large central park. Instead of a black-tie dinner, it was an open-air community picnic, open to all employees and their families, with food trucks, live music, and activities for the kids. The focus was no longer on self-celebration, but on connection. At the center of the event was a stage where the night's main announcement would be made. The official partnership between the Sterling Foundation and the School for Deaf Children that now welcomed Leah. Elena, as the head of the inclusion program, was slated to be one of the speakers. She had spent the week prior in a state of paralyzing anxiety. Public speaking was her greatest fear. To speak about her own story, her own vulnerability, seemed impossible. "I can't do it." "Arthur," she told him the day before the event, "I'm not a speaker, I'm just me." "That's exactly why you need to speak, Elena," he replied gently. "People don't need another corporate speech. They need to hear a real story. Your story." The time came. Arthur went on stage first, and in a short, humble speech, he talked about the new direction of the company. He didn't mention Rick's name or the scandal. Instead, he spoke of the importance of listening to the voices that are too often silenced. Then, he called Elena to the stage. She walked slowly toward the microphone, her heart hammering. The crowd of faces stared up at her. She saw her former colleagues from the cleaning crew in the front row. She saw executives who had once barely noticed her. And she saw Leah, perched on the shoulders of one of her new teachers, looking at her with radiant pride. She took a deep breath, gripped the lectern with both hands to steady herself, and began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but she didn't talk about the policies of the new program. Instead, she told her story. She spoke of fear, of invisibility, of the daily struggle of a single mother trying to give her daughter the world. She spoke of the pain of humiliation and the despair of unemployment. And then she spoke of unexpected kindness, of a second chance that transformed her life. As she spoke, a deep silence fell over the park. There were no more executives and janitors. There were only people, connected by a story of vulnerability and resilience. Silent tears streamed down the faces of many in the audience. Elena ended her speech by speaking directly to Leah in American Sign Language. As an interpreter translated her words, "Everything I have done, every fight, every tear, was for you, my little light." You taught me how to listen with my heart. And today, I hope we can all learn to do the same." The crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't polite, corporate applause, but a genuine explosion of emotion. Elena, trembling and teary-eyed, looked out at the audience and saw something that made her catch her breath. Off to the side of the stage, partially hidden by the sound equipment, stood Daniel. He wasn't there out of obligation. He had come on his own, and he wasn't looking at the stage, but at his father. Arthur was standing next to Elena, clapping with the rest of the crowd, but his gaze was locked on Daniel. For an instant, time stood still. In that look exchanged across the crowd, father and son saw each other truly for the first time in years. Daniel didn't smile, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was a beginning, a small gesture that meant everything. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, the beginning of forgiveness. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. The board's approval, the company's success, all of it paled in comparison to that simple nod. He had spent his life building a legacy of concrete and steel, but in that moment, he realized the only legacy that mattered was the one he was building right there, in that park, under the stars. A legacy of humanity, of second chances, and of the quiet love between a father and a son. After the event in the park, a new atmosphere settled over Sterling Corp. Elena's story, shared with such courage, had broken down invisible barriers. The conversations in the hallways changed. There were more smiles, more kindness, a sense of shared purpose that went beyond sales targets. Elena's program flourished, becoming a model for other companies. She was no longer viewed with suspicion, but with profound respect. She had found her voice, not just as an executive, but as an advocate for every employee who felt marginalized. She organized workshops, created direct channels of communication to senior management, and ensured that every corporate decision considered the human impact. The most significant change, however, occurred in Arthur. He delegated more, trusted his team, and started leaving the office on time. He rediscovered small pleasures that work had made him forget: walking in the park, reading a book that wasn't a business report, cooking a simple meal. His relationship with Daniel continued to heal, step by step. The nod at the event had been the open door. They began having weekly dinners, which became a sacred tradition. On one of those nights, as they prepared a meal together, Daniel finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Why did you do it, Dad?" "For her." "For Elena." Arthur stopped chopping vegetables and turned to his son, wiping his hands on a towel. "Because I saw in her daughter, in Leah, something I had lost in myself," he said, his voice low and sincere. "She looked at me without the weight of my name, my position. She just saw a man, and her mother, with so little, had a richness that I, with everything, didn't possess. Her dignity reminded me of my own, and it reminded me of you," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "When your mother left, I buried myself in work because it was the only thing I knew how to control. I built walls around myself, and I ended up leaving you on the other side. Helping Elena wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about trying to tear down those walls. It was the first step in trying to find my way back to you." Daniel was silent for a long time, absorbing the words. For the first time, he didn't see the CEO or the absent father. He saw a vulnerable man, admitting his pain and his mistakes. He stepped forward and, somewhat awkwardly, hugged his father. It was a quick, almost shy embrace, but it broke the last barrier of ice between them. "I'm sorry too, Dad," Daniel murmured against Arthur's shoulder. "I didn't know how to get through the walls either." The resolution of their conflicts was not a single event, but an ongoing process. Arthur didn't become a perfect father overnight, and Daniel didn't forget years of emotional neglect, but they learned to talk, to listen, to forgive. For Elena, peace came in a quieter way. She bought a small apartment in a leafy neighborhood near Leah's new school, For the first time in years, she had a home that was truly hers. She no longer thought of Arthur with fear or servile admiration, but with a quiet friendship and a deep mutual respect. They were partners in building something better. One afternoon, Arthur received a small package in his office. Inside was a drawing from Leah. It was two stick figures, one large and one small, holding hands under a smiling sun. Below, in shaky, childish handwriting, was the word friend. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He took the drawing and placed it in the silver picture frame on his desk, replacing the old photograph of a painful past with the symbol of a hopeful future. The empire of glass and steel around him hadn't changed, but he had. He finally understood that true strength wasn't in commanding, but in connecting. A year later, the autumn afternoon sun cast a golden light over the same park where everything had changed. The leaves on the trees painted the ground in shades of red and yellow. The air was crisp and carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of a mild winter. Arthur sat on a picnic blanket spread on the grass, his tie loosened and the sleeves of his shirt rolled up. He no longer looked like a king in his castle, but a man at peace in his garden. Beside him, Leah sat cross-legged, a picture book open on her lap. She pointed to a figure and looked up at him, her eyebrows raised in a silent question. Arthur smiled, and, with intense and slightly clumsy concentration, "He made the sign in ASL for butterfly." Leah giggled, a silent laugh that shook her shoulders, and she corrected the movement of his fingers with professorial patience. He laughed back, a genuine laugh, free of the weight he had carried for so long. He was no longer fluent in the language of profits and losses, but he was slowly learning the language of the heart. A short distance away, sitting on a bench under an old oak tree, Elena watched them. She was talking with a friend, but her gaze often returned to the scene on the grass. There was a serenity on her face, the serenity of someone who had found her place in the world. She was no longer a victim, but the architect of her own life, and a force for change in the lives of many others. The sound of footsteps on the grass made Arthur look up. Daniel was approaching, carrying a picnic basket. He didn't join them on the blanket right away. He stopped a few feet away, watching the interaction between his father and the little girl. He watched the ease, the tenderness, the patience his father showed. He saw a man he barely knew, a man who was learning how to be present. Then, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. It was a smile of hope, of acceptance. He walked over to the blanket and sat down, offering an apple to Leah, who took it with a solemn nod. The silence between the three of them wasn't awkward. It was a shared silence, full of unspoken meaning. Arthur looked from Leah to Daniel and then over to Elena, who waved at him from the bench. In that moment, he saw the true balance sheet of his life. His greatest asset wasn't in a bank vault, but right there, in that park. It was the connections he had almost lost and the ones he had built from the ruins of his old life. He finally understood that the greatest empire a man could build wasn't measured in square feet or in dollar signs, but in the quality of the human bonds he nurtured. It was a legacy that couldn't be bought or sold, only earned with humility, courage, and an open heart. A little girl's silence had taught him how to hear life's most important melodies. The sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant colors. Arthur leaned back on the grass, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath him, and for the first time in a very, very long time, he felt completely and unequivocally at home.